Start here. Okay, it looks like that means we are recording. Anyhow, so I want to you guys can look at me. You don't have to look at the screen.
Oh, okay. Okay.
There's nothing to see on the screen.
Just me.
You're going to see the same thing.
Okay.
It's not going to be any different.
Okay.
This is much better to look at, no?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to welcome everybody. So I'm going to be it's a hybrid class. So I look at the screen and I look at you guys, and that way I can talk to both people and get connected to both people. It's harder to get connected to people that are on Zoom because that's just the way it is. You know, when people, that's the beauty of people being in person. So Zoom has been a big miracle and done a tremendous thing for people all throughout the entire world during the pandemic. But it looks like Zoom is here to stay, and that's the way it is. So we're going to have to accommodate humanity in person and on Zoom. So that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to start lesson number 3, and not even briefly, just with a few sentences, I'm just going to quickly tell you what lesson 1 and lesson 2 are all about. And obviously we can't spend too much time on that because otherwise we wouldn't have enough time to spend on our 3rd lesson. But we are talking about anti-Semitism, but we are talking about it in a very different way through the lenses of spirituality and Torah. If we see it through those lenses, we can have we can for sure have a very different perspective on anti-Semitism. The course is titled Outsmarting Antisemitism, and it's not called Defeating Antisemitism. Defeating anti-Semitism will take place once the Mashiach comes. So when the Mashiach comes, you know what the Mashiach is, that's the Messiah. He will bring peace into this world, the recognition of goodness, the recognition that God is the supreme power over this world. And if people have this transparency of divinity, they will know you can't hate. That's why the badness, the evil, will be eradicated. But until then, we are going to have to figure out how to outsmart it. So if you want to outsmart it, you have to be smart. You have to figure out how to address anti-Semitism in a balanced and smart way. That is the trick of dealing with anti-Semitism. So obviously, the anti-Semitism runs the gamut from the worst possible scenario where they try to create a genocide against us. So you have your story of Purim, Haman, who tries to create a genocide against the Jewish people, and miraculously, we were saved, we were spared. And then you have, in our very recent times, 70 years ago, you had the story, the Holocaust, the tragedy of the Holocaust, the viciousness of the Nazis to annihilate 6 million Jewish people. That's only Jewish people. And the target were Jews. So in lesson number 1, we spoke about we have to have a proper emotional response. We have to be able to absorb the ideas of anti-Semitism in an emotional and balanced way. If you can keep yourself emotionally intact, keep a good frame of mind, you can address it in a proper way. Otherwise, you're going to go off the handle, go off the rails, and you're just not going to address it properly, and you might make things a little worse. But what we really addressed at the end of lesson number 1 is something very powerful. I'm not going to do any justice to it because that's why we spent an hour and a half in that first lesson. And that was the idea that everything that we receive in our lives, so that means the sustenance, the food, our housing, shelter, our security, everything that we have in our life, our health, these are blessings from God. And when we go out there and we have to do things for self-preservation, if you don't eat, if you don't go to work, you're not going to survive, you're not going to live. But the outcome, when you receive the blessing didn't come from your work, it came from Hashem. And that is the miracle of life. So people don't see it as miracles. They say it's the miracle that I worked so hard. It's, the toil and the sweat and the blood that I've shed for all my blessing, it came from me. We recognize that it all comes from God. Why is this important? This is important because it makes us realize that when we fight anti-Semitism, and we prevail, we do. Look at the land of Israel, and we have over 6-7 million Jews living in the state of Israel, and prosperously, they're living, with freedom, liberty, and much more success than almost any other nation in the Middle East. That is the blessing of Hashem. We have to recognize that, and that gives us greater power to our efforts to thwart off and to fight off anti-Semitism. That was lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, we discussed the idea that number 1, anti-Semitism is not new. It might change its form, it might change its shape, but nevertheless, it's ancient. It's old news. I don't know if I argued, I posed the idea that it actually goes back to day number one. Who was the first Jew? Abraham and his wife Sarah. Abraham and his wife Sarah were the first Jewish people. And the moment they declared themselves as Jews, they didn't call themselves Jews. The word Jew actually comes from the word Judah, and that comes even after the times of King David. The original Jews were called
Israelites.
Hebrews. Even Israelites comes later. So Abraham was called a Hebrew, coined from the word Ivri. All right, that's the way the pagans called Abraham. The reason they called him Ivri, or Hebrew in English, is because he was from the other side. He was ideologically opposed to their paganism, to their idol worship ways, and therefore he was on the other side of them ideologically. And when you see someone who's on the other side, you start not liking them, and the not liking gets internalized and absorbed by your soul and your heart, and the hate starts coming out, and you use all different kinds of excuses for hating the person to the point where you feel that you get to torture them, you get to take away their liberty, you get to take everything away from them to the point that you feel that you can eradicate these people. And that's what the people in the times of Abraham did. King Nimrod, I spoke about it last week. King Nimrod tried to kill Abraham and Sarah. All right, but at the end of the lesson, what we really spoke about was that what we were discussing, so why is there anti-Semitism? Why do they hate us? And we went through different kinds of analysis, but there was one beautiful, deeper meaning that we understand through the lenses of Kabbalah, more metaphysical, and that is that, and it's possible that the anti-Semite is not conscientiously aware of it, but it's deep inside their soul, and that is that the Jewish person or the Jewish people represent the idea that we are created in this world for a purpose and for meaning. So, of course, we can live in this world and we can achieve, great heights and successes, but most of them are either monetary successes, they're physical, material successes in life. Even if you reach a high point in your job, in your position, in your job, it's still material success. And many people think that they feel fulfilled in that success. So if I got a promotion, if I make more money, if I own more real estate, if I, even if my kids are doing really well as a result of all the work that I put into it, though that's a meaningful thing, that is not yet the ultimate reason and purpose for your creation. The reason we are here in this world is to partner with God to make this world into a divine world. So there's much greater and deeper meaning of life. And we as Jewish people, whether we like it or not, whether we think that we're believers of God, or we think we're, God forbid, atheists and we don't even like God, no matter what we do, we represent those ideas. So Haman, we spoke about the story, one of the first and one of the greatest haters of the Jewish people, one of the greatest anti-Semites. He's the prototype of anti-Semitism. Haman hated Mordechai. Mordechai is the hero, him and Esther, but Mordechai is a Jew, a hero in the story of Purim. And he always reminded Haman that no matter how much success he had in his life, because he reached the top. He became the closest advisor that one can possibly reach to the king whose name was Ahasuerus. He had so much power that he can sway him into doing lots of things. And one of the things that he convinced him was to destroy and annihilate the Jewish people. So he thought he had meaning and purpose in life. But when he saw when he saw Mordechai the Jew, he realized that this guy reminds him that his ultimate purpose in life is not there. But he chose to take the wrong path. Instead of having a discussion with Mordechai, what did he do? He chose to destroy Mordechai. He could have had a nice little class with him. Maybe he would have done a little JLI class, and maybe he would have been more aware of what his purpose is and could have had a better life. But he chose the opposite. So here we are today in lesson number 3. And in lesson number 3, we are going to speak about a specific anti-Semitism, and we're going to focus on the modern form of anti-Semitism, and that is to try to weaken and even destroy the state of Israel. If you look at modern day anti-Semitism, we clearly see that they would like to get rid of the Jews from the land of Israel. They would like to take away the name of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the Holy Land. And that is the new form of anti-Semitism. It's not so new, but relative to the scheme of history of Jewish people of over 4,000 years, here we are today, and that is one of the scariest kinds of anti-Semitism that is going around in our times. So the reality of today is that a lot of anti-Semitic activity, though by no means all of it, that means there's other stuff going on. We spoke about the shooting of white supremacists in synagogues. There was a Chabad in Poway. In Pittsburgh, we had the shooting. But it really, primarily in the news and what's really going on in our world, it really revolves around a little tiny country, a little dot on the map. If you look at the map, what's this? You barely can see it. You need even a young, youthful person who doesn't need reading glasses. You got to take a magnifying glass to actually see the land of Israel relative to all other countries. So we're going to discuss that. And this really leads us to the idea about how anti-Semitism is ancient, it's old, and it actually sort of renews itself over and over and over. So we got rid of Nazism, but what do we have right now? We have a new form of anti-Semitism. So we could see that anti-Semitism is like a virus. And what does a virus do? We're in the midst of a virus. A virus creates new variants. What's a new variant? A new variant means it mutates itself. So we have, for example, a great immune system, and Baruch Hashem, that's the reason we are alive, because if we ever have a virus, and even in COVID, we have viruses, but most people can fight it off because if you have a healthy immune system, you can fight it off. But what's the problem? You get the flu one year, you can get it the next year, and you can get it in 5 years, and you can get it almost every year. I mean, hopefully most people don't. But we've all had the flu, or perhaps we even had COVID, and God willing, and hopefully we've all survived it. But the point is that the virus figures out how to mutate itself and go from one variant to another variant. So the virus is considered negative, it's bad, it's evil, it tries to destroy, it finds a new way to mutate itself. So if you look at anti-Semitism, let's start with, originally anti-Semitism mutated itself in what we'll call religion. So the ancient pagans in the times of Abraham and the people, Christians and Muslims, and Haman himself makes that accusation. The Pharaoh in the story of the Pharaoh and the Jews, what is the accusation? They always say that these people are different than us. That's the accusation. They are not doing the things in the right way. And when people feel and believe that there is a group of people, and Jews have always been a small group. We've never been this majority of people. We're a minority of people, smaller group of people. And they say, how could these people do things differently? They disparage our Savior. In Christianity, they'll make that accusation. Islam, they'll say that they don't accept certain aspects of their ideology, of their beliefs. The pagans say, what do you mean you don't accept our way of life? You're not doing it the right way. So religion became what you call the source of authority. So if religion is the source of authority, and the Jews are doing the opposite of the source of authority, what happens then? I now find logic, rationalization, why I can hate the Jewish people. Then later on, you could say that people said, we're not that excited about religion. At some point, religion was not so exciting. People started to shift away from religion. That doesn't mean religion went away, but religion was not the coolest thing around. And when people started to realize the idea of science, for example. So science now was replaced as the source of authority. So people looked at science. If you, God forbid, oppose science, then we must castigate you. We must make sure that you fall in line with the sciences. So what did the Nazis end up doing? Scientifically, they believed that the Jewish people posed a threat to who?
To them.
And what were them? What did the Nazis consider themselves? The Aryan race. So you have this small group of people who are not Aryan to them. And that's why they would do these ridiculous tests and look how long your nose was and the color of your hair, the color of your eyes, your skin pigmentation, all these crazy things in the name of science, fake science. All right. That became their source of authority. that gave them legitimization to torture and ultimately to create a genocide against the Jewish people. If you think about it, it's I've thought about it, and I always wondered, all these guys working in concentration camps, and their job was literally from 9 to 5, maybe longer or maybe less, come to a concentration camp, and their job is to kill people, the Jewish people, to murder and to torture Jewish people. How do you come home at night and greet your wife and play with your children and do homework with your children and lead a life like everything is good? The reason is because they have a source of authority that is science. And these Jewish people were a threat to the higher authority, the source of their authority, which is science, a threat to the Aryan race, a threat to what they considered humanity at that time. So we must get rid of these people who are creating the threat to their existence. So this is how anti-Semitism now mutated itself, God, the opposite. It mutated itself. Yeah, Paula.
Weren't they also jealous too of the certain accomplishments?
Yeah, we spoke about those ideas last week as well.
By that.
Right. So Paula is, and I have to repeat that because it's hard for them to hear it. No, you have to be sorry. I'm repeating it. I'm happy to do it. So Paula's mentioning an idea that we spoke about last year, that there's certain elements of jealousy about the Jewish people, and we went through a series of different ideas regarding why there's anti-Semitism. So the idea of why there's anti-Semitism was spoken about last week. You can watch that on this is all recorded, so you can watch that point. Today, what we want to talk about is the current anti-Semitism, which is what I'm going to talk about right now. So now, science is not that exciting for the people. That's not the higher and source of authority for people. After World War II, after the Holocaust, what did people start to care more about?
Material things.
Well, they always cared about material things, and that's true. Politics, economy, well, those are things that always took place. So what is let me say this, the thing that becomes your authority, that is the thing that compels you, your big belief in life, and if you believe in that, you have to fight for that cause. It's the cause that you have to fight for. No, religion is already...
Money?
Not money. Money is always, people always had a desire for money. But what is the thing that you're going to, the thing that you're going to fight for, maybe to give up your life and probably to harm other people as a result of that?
Country, family,
human rights.
Oh, it is?
Human rights, everything is based on human rights today.
Right. What is my right?
Everything is rights about today, right? Everybody's accused of being a racist. Everybody, yeah. Human rights has been, well, it didn't, for sure in the more liberal progressive. I'm not saying everybody's like that. For me, it's not a truth.
Yeah.
I'm not saying for everybody.
Yeah, okay.
I'm saying the anti-Semites.
Yeah, okay.
I'm talking about anti-Semites right now. Now it mutated itself, and you'll see where I'm going with this because this is a very important idea. How do people, civilized, good people, they're coming from good families, hardworking parents, and they sent them to good schools, and they grew up in nice communities. They didn't grow up amongst the Nazis. They actually hate the Nazis. They hate the white supremacists. So they are now fighting for human rights. So this is more in the progressive and the more liberal. I mean, not that we don't care about human rights, but this becomes their ideology. This becomes the highest point of authority in their life, and that's the thing, the cause that they are fighting for in their life. So everything that falls under that, the fight under that, they now have carte blanche to do whatever they want, almost, as long as they protect human rights. So anti-Semitism today has mutated itself into what we call human rights. And under this guise, they see, for example, the United States of America. They look at the United States of America, and the United States of America is where we're colonialists. Not only, I shouldn't say just the United States, the Western civilization, we're out there to take away land and control the entire world at the expense of what? At minorities. So at indigenous people, at people of other colors, different races, and they feel that now they have to defend and protect those people. So who are they going to fight? The big, powerful racists, okay? And who is the greatest example or the greatest violators of human rights? Israel. Israel has become the great. That's what the claim is. Obviously, it's based on lies. But what they're anti-Semites. They're haters of Jewish people. But they are cloaking themselves in the garments of righteousness, and saying that Israel, the Jewish people, are violators of human rights. People of Palestine, right? So they'll make all the accusations, apartheid, a whole bunch of accusations that we're going to talk about. And what they basically do is they fire up the people, who care about human rights, including Jewish people, mostly on college campuses, and they get them really excited. They say, "Don't you care about human rights?" And what does the nice Jewish kid say? "Of course I care about human rights. Do you know what's going on in the land of Israel? X, Y, and Z, apartheid, the rights of Palestinians are being taken away, and they're killing them and they're murdering them. You have to fight for them." And the Jewish kid will be more than happy to denounce the Jewish state and to denounce Jewish people in order to gain entry into this cause and into this fight. And they themselves aid and abet hatred and anti-Semitism without them realizing, because what is now the source of authority? Human rights. As long as they are fighting for human rights, everything will go. And the sadness of this is that they will agree to the torture and the killing of Jewish people. And that means if a Jew gets killed, they say, well, that's the price you pay. I mean, we're not happy about it, but they will have all these different excuses. They will not stand up for it. Let's read text number 1. It's you'll hear it. So I know you don't have books, but this is from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Do you guys know who Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was? He passed away a year ago. He was the chief rabbi of Great Britain for many years, and probably one of the greatest writers and most articulate men that have lived for many years. I love him. He's really good. Here's what Rabbi Sachs says. Text number 1, page 84. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way to understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in doing so defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. So nobody wants to be a hater. You don't want to walk around and say, well, I'm this demon, really bad, evil person trying to kill people. Hitler didn't think of himself that way. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimization in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. That is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost its prestige, and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on 2 persuasive sciences: social Darwinism, which is the idea that in society, as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race, which is a threat to the Aryan race. By the late 20th century, this is pretty much now, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. So this was not my idea. That you thought I was such a smart guy. That is, I cheated. No, I thought I would give you sort of heads up before we read it. So now the reading will resonate a little bit. I like to do that. That's my way of teaching. That is why Jews or the Jewish state are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights. What are the 5 sins that the Jewish people are committing, against human rights? The source of authority.
Suppression.
Let's start with the 5. Number 1, they are accused of racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. Those are I'm sure there's more stuff, but those are the 5 things that you will typically hear a mantra over and over and over. But those are the 5 things that the Jewish people are committing against the Palestinians. Now, if you're a Jewish kid and you don't really have a good foundation of life, and a good understanding of what's going on in the world, and you're taught human rights is the biggest thing in the world, well, guess what? You're going to want to fight human rights, and you will feel so good about yourself. You will wake up in the morning, feel altruistic, because who are you fighting against? Your own people. Imagine a German got up and fought the Nazis. That was noble. It was very hard to find those, right? The Polish, how many Polish people were very happy to give away Jewish people to the Nazis? Very few actually saved them. There are stories, but it's far in between of how many actually saved them. So these Jewish kids are walking around on their high horse, and this is fantastic. So there's not much we could really do. I shouldn't say there's not much. There are things we can do. We can have maybe better PR. We have to fight them. Today with social media and various different ways. I'm not saying not, but certainly we have to recognize that the sadness in this whole thing, what we can control is how we raise our Jewish children, which we're going to talk about in a few more moments. All right, so now, if you talk about criticism of Israel, do people have a right to criticize Israel? Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course, you have a right. Not only do you have a right, you should. If there's something that's legitimately wrong with Israel, should we criticize Israel? By all means. If they committed whatever, even a crime, let's criticize Israel for it. Whatever it might be, politically, that's how you make other people better. That's how you make other societies better. That's how you make other countries better. So how do you differentiate between legitimate criticism of Israel versus anti-Semitic, means criticism motivated by hatred of Jews? How do you differentiate? So they're saying all these terrible things, accusations against Israel. Maybe the guy is a good guy and really trying to fix up Israel. How do you know that what they're saying, whether it's intentionally or not intentionally, how do you know which is anti-Semitic, which is hatred, and which is legitimate? How do you differentiate? What would you do? What would be your formula?
Well, one thing I'd want to know the specifics. It's not just Israel this and the Jews that. I'd want to know what specifically are you talking about? Let's address that one thing.
Good.
And the source.
Yes. So you would debate them. Okay. And then the source, exactly. And somebody mentioned yesterday, if as a result of what they're saying, people will be hurt and harmed and maybe even killed, then this is not coming from a good place. Right. And those are all true things. And what you're really saying is, I'm going to say it in other words and give it better definition, because when you hear this idea, you'll say, it's like that aha moment. Of course, that's easy to tell. Okay. And actually, you don't even have to go through a debate. It'll be much easier because you can ask them very simple questions. And what we do is we have to differentiate the two kinds of criticism, one driven by hatred and one is legitimate. How do you know? You test them with what we call the double standard. So what is the double standard? When we see people and organizations accusing Israel of human rights violations, right? Ask them a simple question. Have you stood up to Iran? Have you stood up to North Korea? Have you stood up to others? Syria? There's plenty of countries. There are plenty of people that you can accuse of these human rights violations. If they don't do that, which in most cases is what happens, then you know that what are they driven by? It's pure hate. You follow what I'm saying? I mean, in life, generally speaking, if you see two people committing the same violation, the same sin, and you only choose one, right, and pick on one of the people, it's a double standard. It means you're not driven by correcting the sin, you're driven by some form of bias or hatred or whatever it might be, okay? So that is the technique, that is the formula to make it easy and simple. Well, it's not that simple, but it's easy. You ask them those very simple questions. Why are you so obsessed by Israel?
Because they hold Israel to a higher standard. Israel holds itself to a higher standard.
That's what they say, but that's baloney. Okay? If you care about human rights, it doesn't matter where it happens. That means if you never say anything, and I'll give you an example. I'll show you a video at the end of the lesson. In the video, you're going to see, look at the UN, for example. The UN puts out about 100 resolutions a year. I'm rounding it off. It's not that many, as you would think. In those resolutions, they're basically, I would say at least 30 to 40% of those resolutions are against Israel. And almost none, no, zero against China. I'm trying to remember the video, but most of it is, it's an obsession against Israel. That is anti-Semitism. Okay, so yeah, that's nice to say that we hold Israel and the Jews to a higher standard. I love that. I think that's fantastic. You should. By the way, they're all lies anyhow. All these human rights accusations are lies. They're not true. They're not credible. But let's say they think that it is credible. Why aren't you talking about it to other people? You just care about human rights. You don't care about if Jewish people are on a higher standard or in a lower standard. It really doesn't matter. But anyhow, the point is, it's the double standard. Let's read the idea of a double standard, because in 2,000 years ago, when the Jewish people were under siege by the Romans, there was an emperor, the Roman emperor. His name was Emperor Hadrian. And Hadrian was a big hater, a big anti-Semite, and he is accused of having the double standard. So, for example, he made quite a few accusations against the Jews. So, for example, he would say that the Jewish people were barbaric. In what way were they barbaric? What do you think the accusation was? What did the Jewish people do that was so barbaric? No, it's before. Christianity is not around.
We gave sacrifices.
The way they ate or something.
Huh? They also
ate differently, different foods, different.
They did circumcision.
Oh.
That was barbaric.
Oh.
If you look at the pagans, they were against circumcision. We're not going to get into circumcision, but the point is that you think the Jews were the only ones. You're right. Minority of the world's population at that time did not do circumcision. Today, maybe it's, I don't know, 30, 40% of the world's population. In America, I think it's 70%. But in those days, very few people did it. But it wasn't only Jews doing it.
Right.
So he accused the Jews of being violators of human, torture. Okay. Another accusation was that the Jewish people were lazy. Why did he accuse them of being lazy? What practice did the Jews have that would indicate
The Sabbath.
the Sabbath? Very good. Look at these lazy people. The pagans were known to work 7 days a week. They always worked nonstop. They believed in that whole idea that a person should never ever stop working. If you stop working, if there is a day of rest, it means you're a lazy people. All right, which is contradictory, because they would also accuse the Jewish people of loving money and pursuing that. So, and they're hard workers. So that's why it makes no sense. Anti-Semitism really doesn't make sense, because on the one hand, you say they're lazy because they keep the Sabbath. On the other hand, they're pursuers of money. If you're pursuing money, you're working pretty hard for it. So here is what the Midrash tells us about the accusation of double standard to this emperor. Here it is, text number 2, page number 88. Here we go. In the Contrion, I don't even know who he is, wrote to Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcise. If it is the Sabbath observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe the Sabbath. Clearly then you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment from you. So the idea of a double standard for an anti-Semite is old and ancient. It's nothing new. So that is what the double standard is all about. But to take this even a little further, if you look at Natan Sharansky, do you know who Natan Sharansky is? He was a Jewish man who lived in Russia. And he became famous in the 1970s because, like many Jews, he wanted to immigrate to Israel. Now, under the communists, they controlled everything about your life. They told you where to work, where to live, how many kids to have, everything. And if you wanted to travel, you had to ask for permission. And if you wanted to immigrate and leave Russia, you had to get permission as well. So therefore, Natan Sharansky submitted his application to leave Russia. And of course, they denied his request. And he started to make some noise about it. And he joined a group called the Refuseniks. And the Refuseniks, ultimately, many of them, unfortunately, were arrested. A hokey pokey trial, and they convicted them of whatever criminal activities, revolutionary activities, and they literally gave them harsh punishments and threw them in Siberia in these gulags. Anyhow, last week or 2 weeks ago, we had a really interesting conversation about Natan Sharansky and anti-Semitism towards him. But Natan Sharansky ultimately was freed There was a deal that they made with the United States of America in the early 1980s, and ultimately he made his way to the land of Israel. He became a writer, and he was actually for a small time a politician. He headed a party in the Parliament of Israel, the Knesset, but now he's a speaker and a writer and a very thoughtful person. But he speaks about modern day anti-Semitism, and he gives you the formula to distinguish between legitimate and anti-Semitic criticism. And I'm going to read that right now. And the idea of double standard is one of them. And he calls it the 3D test. So you can give an anti-Semite a test, and you will know if it's anti-Semitic or it's driven by legitimate criticism. Text number 3, page 89. Here we go. I believe that we can apply a simple test. I call it the 3D test to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. What's demonization? When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of sensible proportions, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis, and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz. This is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. So if you take things out of proportion and blow it up, that's called demonization. The second D is the test of double standards. That's what we discussed. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of unknown and major abuses such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria is ignored, when Israel's Magen David Adom alone among the World Ambulance Service is denied admission into the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. By the way, the Red Cross did admit them into the Red Cross after 2006 or 2007, something like that. The point is, it took a very long time. 2006, 2007, Magen David Adom was established, I believe, at the beginning, or maybe before the state was created, but whatever, it's certainly an old entity. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples of the world, this too is anti-Semitism. Tell me a nation, a group of people that to this day is delegitimized. We say that they don't have a right to that land. You know how many countries have been formed, even post the Holocaust, when the United Nations or the League of Nations, which was an earlier body of the world, and we've established places for people, everybody's accepting and no one's delegitimized their country. The single nation that is being delegitimized until this very day, it hasn't ended yet, hasn't changed, are the Jewish people. We're the only ones who are not recognized as having a land that belongs to Jewish people. It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing idea. All right, so now we have a much better understanding about Israel-related anti-Semitism. Now we got the point of what is going on in our times. And how did this mutate itself now? So it's not religion that's driving it. It's not science that's driving it. By the way, there are other things that drive it as well. But we're obviously, for the sake of the lesson, just to speak about 3 bigger points. The third thing today is the human rights source of authority that's driving this anti-Semitism. And that gives them the legitimacy, the permission to say, well, we got to fight these bad Jewish people because they are violating this higher morality, this higher authority called source of authority, which is human rights. All right, so the bottom line is, what can we do about it? So obviously, there are many things that we can do about it. We can do on a financial level to help Israel economically. Economically means buying bonds. You can visit Israel and help tourism. That's a huge source of income for the people in Israel. Supporting organizations that help advance Israel's interests and to combat the lies and the anti-Semitism against Israel. Those are important things. On a spiritual level, if we behave as Jewish people, we light Shabbat candles, a man puts on tefillin, we do kind deeds to one another, there's a godly element there as well. We're doing things for Israel in our spirituality. Those are things that we can do. But our focus in today's lesson will be on a unique aspect about this whole human rights driven anti-Semitism, okay? Which really requires special attention. And that's why we're going to talk about it, because it's the part of this whole anti-Semitism that we can do something about it going forward. We've made big mistakes in the past, and we'll talk about those mistakes. And what can we do going forward to ensure that we don't give any support from our Jewish population? How is it that young Jewish kids are joining what we call BDS movements? Boycotting Israel. That's an awful thing that is going on amongst the Jewish people. So, and obviously this is one of the more painful parts about Israel-focused anti-Semitism, that these young Jewish kids are all, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of them are joining forces with the haters of Israel by demonizing them, by treating it with a double standard, and certainly even by delegitimizing the land of Israel, that it's a Jewish land. They're agreeing that Jewish people should not reside and not live in the land of Israel. Where they should go, I don't know. That's another. Maybe we should go to Montana. I don't know. Maybe that would be it's a big place. No, there's more cows in Montana than people. All right. So why is this happening? And we're going to talk about why is this happening and what we actually can do about it. So by way of explaining what we can do about it, I want to talk about and look back at our Jewish history, and I want to identify two types of anti-Semitism. And if you understand this point, you will understand that Jews would never support one of the two kinds of anti-Semitism. They would never gain any supporters of it. We'll call one Haman anti-Semitism. What's a Haman anti-Semitism? Haman anti-Semitism is when white supremacists, when the Nazis, when, I don't know, different groups determine that they have to annihilate the Jewish people for whatever reasons however it mutated itself. And they say, we're going to create a genocide. We're getting rid of the Jewish people physically. Means if you have an ounce of Jewish blood in you, you're a goner. All right, let me ask you a question. How easy would it be for Nazis to convince Jewish people to join their cause? It's not likely that a young Jewish kid is going to be in college and they're going to be recruited. It's almost impossible. Haman wouldn't have that possibility. The Nazis didn't have that possibility. This kind of anti-Semitism has a very difficult, if not impossible, time attracting Jews to join their aspirations. But then there's what we call Antiochus anti-Semitism. That's another kind of anti-Semitism. Who's Antiochus? Antiochus was, it's not anti, like anti-something. Yeah, it's a Greek name. Yeah. Antiochus. Antiochus was the Greek emperor in the story of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is coming up, everybody. We're gonna have a parade next Sunday, not this Sunday, in a week from this Sunday, November 28th, and some other events. The flyers are in the mail. You should be getting them this week. Anyhow, Antiochus was the Greek king, and his anti-Semitism, he hated the Jewish people, took a different form. It was a different shape. It was not an accusation where we must annihilate the Jewish people. Antiochus was not going to create any genocide. He was not interested in that. It's not what he was trying to do. He even did not want to ban all of Judaism. He was not seeking to say Jewish people don't study the Torah and don't practice it. He didn't say that. Rather, he only wanted to ban specific practices and beliefs that ran counter to what he called the right way, which means the Hellenistic way. The Hellenistic way of living, if Jewish practices and Jewish teachings ran counter to his right way of seeing things, those are the things that he wanted to shut down. Those are the things that he wanted to deny the Jews to have access to in thought and in practice. So you couldn't teach it, and you certainly couldn't practice those values. So basically, Hellenism or Judaism ran counter to a lot of the values of Hellenism. I'll give you an example. Everybody knows about the Olympics, right? You don't see any harm in the Olympics today, and there is no harm in the Olympics. But what is the source of the Olympics?
Isn't it like the male body or something?
Yes. And it came from the Greeks, the gladiators. That's where it was created. The power of the body, the worship of the body. it was actually, today we don't see it in those ways. Today it's more competitive, and it is about achieving, great heights in the, stretching the human's abilities and that kind of stuff through sports. But it really was the worship of the human body, which was paganistic. So I guess, certain people who were very successful in literally ripping another person into shreds, the gladiators, they were worshipped. Okay, they were gods, so to speak. So this ran against the grain of Judaism. It's totally in opposition to the values that we hold so dear and near to us. How about circumcision, which we mentioned earlier?
Because they were like paraded nude in the streets.
Yes, that's what it was. And they worked out, they were very fit and healthy, and it was that worship. It was not acceptable to Jewish people. Not that we don't believe in health. Of course we believe in that. It's a different, that's totally different. That's a worship of the body. That was not acceptable. Circumcision was a common practice. Almost 100% of Jewish people practiced circumcision. Brit Milah, Shabbat, the idea of laziness. So these are values that he tried to destroy amongst the Jewish people. He didn't say all of Judaism is out. He said only certain aspects of Judaism should be eliminated. So the things that ran against the right way, Hellenistic way of life, those things have to be gone. How they were going to educate their children. The Jewish people said, we're not educating our children with Hellenistic values and ideas. So the Jewish people said, no, we teach our kids the values of our Torah, Jewish values. So anti-Semitism by Antiochus became a little bit more attractive, not a little bit, a lot more attractive to Jewish people living at that time. And sadly, when Antiochus went to war against the Jewish people, there were many Jewish people who made the claim. They said, this guy Antiochus might be right. The Jews are lazy. This whole idea of Sabbath, we have to denounce the Sabbath. It made sense to them. I know it's hard for us to understand that, but remember, the source of authority was religion and ideas, and they were convinced that the Jewish people were doing a bad thing by circumcision, by keeping the Sabbath, by not worshiping the body. These were good things, and they couldn't understand why Jewish people wouldn't implement and allow these values into Jewish life. So many young Jewish people at that time, and probably older Jewish people at that time, joined forces with Antiochus. That's one of the sad parts of the story of Hanukkah. Everybody thinks that the story of Hanukkah was all the Jews revolted against Antiochus. It was the Maccabees and a small group of Jewish fighters who fought against the Syrian Greeks, the Hellenistic armies. But these Jews never denounced their Judaism. They said, we're proud Jews. We love being Jewish. They probably had a big mezuzah on their door. They probably said, we love a lot of things about Judaism. But so they didn't renounce Judaism. They only renounced certain parts of Judaism, okay? But in order for them to gain entry into Antiochus's society, they had to denounce their own fellow Jews. That was something that was very, very important to them. So by doing so, they thought they were saving Jews and Judaism. They were doing something altruistic, something very good for the Jewish people at that time. Well, guess what? This is exactly what is happening today. So the reason we're talking about these two kinds of anti-Semitism is because a lot of these people argue, they say, what are you talking about? We're not Nazis. We're not doing we're against the Nazis because the Nazis were human rights violators. We're against that kind of stuff. But we're also against Jewish violators which is Israel, of human rights as well. So it's important for us to understand that they don't see themselves as joining anti-Semites, because anti-Semites can only be one kind. Those would be the Hamans, the Nazis, the Holocaust, when we murder the Jewish people. But anti-Semitism can wrap itself around the ideas where it doesn't denounce everything about Judaism. It says, oh yeah, certain parts of it, yes, they sort of give certain legitimacy, but it's all with conditions. So the Jew thinks that they're a proud Jew and that they're helping Judaism and Jewish people throughout the entire world. So today, in some progressive circles, and especially on college campuses, we are seeing that based on the idea of the imperialist oppressive forces, America, all of the Western civilization, right? we exploit the disadvantaged. We exploit the indigenous people and racial minorities. And Israel is the biggest violator of that. So the Jewish kid is saying, I don't hate Judaism. I love Judaism. I go to synagogue and I read the Torah even. But this is in the name of their source of authority of human rights. So everything is really blurry and lopsided and contradictory and upside down. And they are now in the camp and amongst the forces who are haters of Jewish people and of Israel. Now, they welcome, the anti-Semites, of course, welcome them, but just like Antiochus forced them to denounce, it didn't take much forcing, by the way, because it was really an influence. That's the forcing I'm talking about. They said, you must denounce Jewish people, but they also forced people to denounce their certain aspects of Judaism. Who knows the famous story in the story of Hanukkah of the Hellenists, the Syrian Greeks, trying to force a mother and her 7 sons to denounce Judaism or denounce or accept the idea of idol worship. There was a woman, her name was Hannah, and she had 7 sons. You can read about it, go online, you'll read about the story. It's a tragic story. Hannah and her 7 sons were coerced. Well, they didn't succeed. They went to Hannah and they said, bring your 7 sons. I guess she was some famous woman with these 7 sons. And they started off with their eldest son and they said, bow down to the idol. And the kid didn't want to do it. He must have been a teenager, and they killed him. Second one, third one, they killed all 7 sons. And the mother convinced them, told the kids, you have to give your life for that. And she ended up jumping off a roof and she committed suicide. They say in Israel, in Sfat, northern part of Israel, I was there, they say that's where she's buried with her 7 sons. That's 2,000 years ago, a little over 2,000 years ago. They try to coerce her into this kind of stuff. That story of coercion, getting someone to, by force, to denounce Israel, happened in 2015. Do you know when you ever heard of a singer, a reggae singer? His name is Matisyahu. Never heard of him. Look him up.
Oh yeah, I do.
Very popular,
Yeah.
Jewish singer.
Matisyahu.
And Matisyahu, at one point, he was literally like a Chabadnik. He had a long beard, and he became very popular, probably because he was Hasidic. He's a tremendous artist. Anyhow, in 2015, he was disinvited from an international reggae music festival that was being held in Spain. And the organizers basically told him that he's disinvited. They disinvited him because of the pressure from members of what we call BDS movement. That's the movement to divest and boycott Israel. But here's the but. If he would make a public statement in support of Palestinian statehood against Israel, against Israel's war crimes, that means he would have to spew lies against the Jewish people, then he would be able to perform. And when he refused to do so, right, his performance was canceled. Let me ask you a question. Do you think there was any other performer that was asked to do anything close to that? Zero. Nada. In Hebrew, we say klum. Nobody. Nobody had to do anything close to that. That's no different than the story of Hanukkah, where Antiochus, actually was one of his generals, who tries to coerce a mother and her 7 sons to denounce aspects of Judaism and to embrace the idea of paganism. This is a modern day kind of coercion into that stuff. Now, if you're a performer and there's your reputation, your money, a lot of things are at stake, you might think twice. And many non-Jewish performers who we know were put under a lot of pressure not to perform in Israel and Tel Aviv, lots of them fell under the pressure, buckled, they didn't do it, but there were others who stand strong. And I don't remember who's who, so I don't want to start saying names. So this is important for us to understand what this anti-Semitism is all about and how Jewish people get to be involved in this stuff. It's not that hard to get them, because this is called the Antiochus kind of anti-Semitism, easy to get Jewish people involved in it. But when I say easy, I'm going to show you that there is a way and there's something that we can do to make it much harder, if not impossible. All right, so our formula clearly identifies them as anti-Semites, especially the major double standard. And bottom line is that they're obsessed with the Jewish state, which is singled out as and is subjected to a very different standard than all other countries. So what could we do about this kind of stuff? So if you were given the position to be the czar of making sure that Jewish youth and kids never end up becoming supporters and entering groups that are haters of Israel, what would you do? What would you do? Sandra, you're now the czar of these things. You're now chosen to come up with a solution. So I think we need to look at education. Education is where it all starts.
Everything starts there.
Exactly. Influence. It's how you influence your kids. And that's why parents have probably the greatest job that anyone can ever imagine. You think your job, that you do as an occupation is difficult and impactful, which it might be. Raising our children is probably the most consequential endeavor that we will undertake in our lives, because we are molding and shaping not only the next generation, all generations for all eternity, because the way we educate our kids, their behavior will be determined by that. And then they get to influence their kids, and then that gets determined by that. And you're now involved in that. Your message is there, and that stays for all eternity. And that's why we are who we are. So we have to realize that we must do a much better job in educating our children. So here is the thing that Jewish people think when they talk about educating people, and especially our kids. We make arguments about why Jewish people have legitimacy towards the land of Israel. What are the common arguments or answers why to these Jew haters, to these people who come with the whole human rights arguments, and what do we argue back? So typically, there's a lot of arguments, but I'm going to talk about three common arguments. One is Jewish people scream out, say, "What do you mean? It's international law." If you look at the 1917 Balfour Declaration, that was when England said we had, they conquered Israel, that region from the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, so this is 1917. By that time, the British said, we don't need this place.
Yeah.
Divide the land, the Arabs, you get half, the Jews got half, and that was one solution. And that was accepted pretty much by the world. But it took until after World War II when the world said, we really got to do something about the Jewish people. They need to have a homeland. Let's vote in it. And we barely made it through the vote in the UN. The United States and Russia was actually that last vote, casting that last vote that I think was by one vote. And that's 1947 when the Jewish people received recognition by the world. And that's law. That's international law. So we say we have international law on our side. So Jewish people walk around. That was a really good argument. But do the anti-Semites buy it? Nah, not really. All right. 1947, there's lots of arguments against it. We won't get into those arguments now. 1947, I just mentioned 1940. Then we have the idea of Jewish survival. I mean, what are the Jewish people going to do? It's a big argument. Should we allow Jewish people just to be annihilated? Look what happened in Germany. We need a homeland for the Jewish people. These are good arguments. They're not bad. They're powerful arguments. Now, I'm talking about these arguments, how we teach the kids about this, not to the anti-Semites. I'm talking about the Jewish kids. We're telling them, reinforcing them with education. This is what we're teaching you. History, that's another argument that's being made. Look at the history. King David lived in Israel. King Solomon lived in Israel. Jews have always lived in Israel, and there's always counter arguments to that. So I want to give you an example. They're very powerful and legitimate arguments that must be made. I'm not trying to belittle them. I'm trying to say that they're good, but for Jewish people, we need something much more powerful. And why do we need something much more powerful? Because if you look at a lot of these kids who are joining the forces of the anti-Semites, BDS movements, they know about this stuff. They were taught about it. Their parents spoke to them about it. Their Hebrew school teachers talked about it. The rabbis got up in the synagogues and spoke about this stuff. They know about this stuff. But guess what? It didn't have a very strong impact on them. So much so that they dropped it. They said, I have a lot of counter arguments to that. So I'm going to give you an example of a Jewish woman. Her name is Phyllis Bennis. I never heard of her, but she is a woman who's an American. She's a prominent American Jewish critic of Israel. I would guess that she is really seeking to dismantle Israel. She doesn't want to kill the Jewish people, but God forbid. I mean, she would love to see Israel be dismantled from Jewish people and given over in a silver platter to the terrorists. That's pretty much what she would like. She was not very impressed with her upbringing as a young Jewish woman or girl growing up in the United States. And here's what she writes about why she no longer accepts the arguments and teachings from when she was a young kid to support Israel, and she changed and went the other direction and became anti-Israel. Here's what she writes. Text number 5, everybody, look on page number 94. Here's what she writes. When I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, so right here in our neighborhood, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel, right? Everybody grew up that way. There really wasn't a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played, were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. Okay? My own breaking with Zionism came in my mid-20s, after reading the letters of Zionism founder Theodor Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, who was a Jewish man living in South Africa at that time, the leader of the British land theft in Africa. So these are colonialists, imperialists, they're trying to take over the world, to support his work in Palestine. So he wants Cecil Rhodes to join him in this imperialism. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes. The letter is a true letter. If Herzl really meant it in the way that she's accusing him of, I don't know, probably not. But nevertheless, that's what she saw. So she is saying, why should I accept this whole political project of settling Jewish people in the land of Israel when the whole point is to colonialize and conquer a land that doesn't belong to you? That's wrong. So her whole life, she grew up understanding all these things. And in one moment, she's 20, in her early 20s, she figured out that there are arguments that counter those arguments. But why was she biased and allowed those arguments to take a hold of her? Why? Because anti-Semitism muted itself in human rights issues. So the higher authority, the source of authority becomes what? Human rights. So she couldn't care less. Couldn't care less about a political solution for a Zionistic political solution for placing Jewish people, if it's going to be at the expense of other people violating human rights. So she now has to weigh Jewish people having a homeland. That's okay, but not when it's going to hurt and harm her ideology, which is the source of her authority, and that is human rights issues. So she now becomes an activist in criticizing Israel for its and Jews for its ambition to return back to the land of Eretz Israel. So what do we see from here? That there are a lot of arguments that you can take that can counter the core beliefs that we teach our kids, Jewish kids I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the anti-Semites now. That's a whole separate thing that we can do for them. And we spoke about it last week. We touched upon it. But for now, we're trying to figure out, so what happened to Cecil Bennis? What could we have done better to help a woman like that to have been not only not a anti-Israel, but to have been pro-Israel, to write books and become an activist in support of Israel and fight the anti-Semites. And she's now joining the ranks of the anti-Semites, but she doesn't see herself that way because human rights is the biggest issue of the day. So she's only concerned about human rights, and she is right in her perspective, by the way. In her way of thinking, she's not wrong. So if we kick and scream, you're an anti-Semite, she says, so what? But human rights is the most important issue of the day, and the Jews are the violators of that. Of course, it's all based on lies, but the point is that something happened, or not something didn't happen. There was something very important that was not taught to her that didn't, and therefore she was not convinced that Israel and Jews have a right to exist in the land of Israel. So let me talk a little bit about that. Let me talk about two ideas that kids are educated in. And those two ideas are, if you grow up in America, Jewish kids, and I think it happened in the last 200 years. It's more of a 200, 250 years that it's happening in Jewish culture. And that is that Jewish kids are taught about the idea. What is Judaism? It is what we call in Hebrew, the term is called Tikkun Olam. Have you ever heard of Tikkun Olam? The word Tikkun Olam, do you know what it means?
Mhm.
What does it mean?
Tikkun olam is like giving.
The repair of the world.
Yeah.
It literally means the repair of the world. It's a great word, by the way. But what's the problem? If I tell you I'm repairing the world, what do you think of me? I'm a good guy? Yeah.
I don't know.
No, 1 second. If I'm repairing the world, I'm
Okay.
fixing the world.
Okay,
I sound good.
yeah,
But what is it? No, on first glance,
Yeah.
I'm repairing the world. I mean, ooh, what are you repairing the world?
You're
What
healer,
a
you're a healer.
you're a healer. You're doing. If I say I'm destroying the world, then you say, oh, you're a terrible person. But if I'm a healer and I'm repairing the world, I must be this very special human being. So we have been telling everybody, what are Jewish people supposed to be preoccupied with? Tikkun olam, repair the world, repair the world. But what is the problem when you say repair the world?
Your perspective, on it, your bias, right?
It's subjective.
Yeah.
It's exactly what Paul is saying. That if I say, let's do Tikkun Olam, it's totally subjective. Guess who thought he was doing repair of the world? Hitler.
Right.
Yeah, wow.
Hitler was doing Tikkun Olam. He didn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm destroying the world.
Right,
He, in fact, said, I'm a good guy. I'm a good person. You ever hear people say, I'm a good person?
yeah.
Do you know that it's the dumbest statement to say, I'm a good person? You know why it's dumb? Because a lot of people who think they're good are destroying the world.
Right.
Like this woman, Phyllis Bennis, is a destroyer of the world, not only Jewish people. It doesn't do good for anybody, not for Palestinians either. They are destroying. Okay, so Tikkun Olam, she thinks she's doing Tikkun Olam, by the way. She's driven by that. I mean, I can't say for sure that's in her head, but I
You feel
I
that, yeah.
feel that I'm guessing based on her upbringing, what she talks about. So the first mistake that we have done is teach kids just do Tikkun Olam. The problem with Tikkun Olam, it's not non-binding. It changes over time. It's whatever you think today is Tikkun Olam. So if today we have to fight X, that is Tikkun Olam. Well, tomorrow we have to support that and fight a new X. Now that's changed. So you never really have anything that's eternal. You have nothing that's solid and that's key, that has chai v'kayam, that has an infinite living force behind it. You just don't have that. The second mistake that we've made, and this is crucial to what we're talking about over here, is that the attachment to Israel is through the lenses of Theodor Herzl. I'm going to be honest, and which is the project of political Zionism. Theodor Herzl was not a believer in God.
I know.
He did not believe that Jews have to move to Israel because of any godly reason. In fact, there were possibilities that Israel was going to become a communist state. There was a possibility that Israel or Jewish people should not move to the geographic land, what we call Israel. We could have moved to Uganda. That was, I'm not saying it was very serious, but it was a discussion. It was open for thought. It wasn't going to happen, but it was discussed. It was a possibility. So they're driven by that idea. And if you're driven by those ideas can have counter arguments to them. They're not foundational and they're not fundamental because they're all subjective and they're non-binding. So what do we have to do? We really have to provide our children and our communities with a much more robust general Jewish education, a much more powerful idea. We have to give them the meat of Judaism. Maybe that's the wrong word. The soul of Judaism. That's a much better word. Give them the soul of Judaism. We have to give them values, not the values of Tikkun Olam, because the values of Tikkun Olam says nothing. What you think Tikkun Olam is, I think it's the opposite. So you and I are going to argue who's repairing the world and who's destroying the world. I'll say you're destroying it, and you're going to say I'm destroying it. I'll say I'm healing it and repairing it. You'll say we'll never get anywhere.
plant trees, and you'll say no.
Exactly. Plant trees, and I'll give you a good reason why you shouldn't plant trees, and vice versa. We'll destroy each other, and nothing will come out of it. So we need to have our values not rooted in Tikkun Olam. We have to have our values rooted in something much more greater and more powerful and more eternal. And what is that? It's rooted in our faith in God and in Torah.
Mhm.
Now, we as Jews look to the Torah and say that's God's word. So if you pick and choose and you don't believe it's God's word, then obviously I'm not discussing that. So if you're raised as a child from when you're a young age, that the root of all our values is in the faith of God and what the Torah tells us, it's binding. Case closed. The Supreme Court has made its decision and no one can reverse it. In America, of course, you can reverse even a Supreme Court decision. But in the Torah, that's different. You can't reverse it. It is what it is. That's what God wants. So if we're rooted in that and we're driven by the source of authority, that is the faith of God, well, guess what? I'm driven by that. Now I start seeing things a lot more clearer. Okay. And I start understanding that everything is driven by that. But the main point I really want to talk about is our second shortcoming. And that was what? Seeing that the land of Israel belongs to us through the lenses of Theodor Herzl in his political drive, his project of political Zionism, the drive to get Jews to have a secure place to live. It's a good idea. I'm not against it. I'm in favor of it. But that's not enough to say that if you teach that to young kids, those kids will never oppose you. What do we have to teach them? We have to see it through the lenses of the Torah. So let me tell you something very, very powerful. If you look at the beginning of the Torah, the first book of the Torah is called what? Genesis, Bereshit, which is Genesis. And the opening of Genesis is the story of what? What's the first story in the Torah?
The creation.
Creation. God created the world. What's the point of the Torah? What is Torah out to? What is the message of Torah for us? How to create a world or something else?
God's presence throughout our lives.
But practically, what does the Torah want from us?
To live in God's image.
To do stuff. To keep Shabbat, to circumcision, to do business honestly, to help the poor, to help the needy, be kind to each other. Practical things, mitzvot. How many mitzvot are there? 613 mitzvot. There's a whole bunch of mitzvot. Let the Torah start off with the mitzvah, the first mitzvah. You know, what's the point that, I'm sure it's a nice thing to tell us about creation. It's not giving us the blueprints. Certainly nobody's learned from the book of Genesis, or at least the first portion of it, how to create a world or a human being. We barely can do cloning, okay? So, which is a big deal, but it's not close to creating a human being from nothing, creating ex nihilo. It's not there. So why does the Torah start that way? And scholars have asked that question. Why does the Torah begin with that concept or the story of the creation of the world? So there is a midrash that Rashi, who lived 1,000 years ago, quotes a midrash from that was written, I don't know, hundreds of years before Rashi himself existed, and he says something very powerful. And he says, so this is over 1,700 years ago, 1,800 years ago that this idea was written. And Rashi quotes it 1,000 years ago. He says that there will always be an accusation by non-Jews against Jews about our relationship to Israel. And they're going to say, Listim atem, that's in Hebrew, you are thieves. Jewish people, you took away the land of Israel. It does not belong to you. You have no rights to it. It doesn't belong to you. And therefore, what should the Jewish people argue? They shouldn't say, well, this Theodor Herzl, he said we need a political solution. We got to figure out how to get Jewish people to safety. The UN has a law. No, we can't say that because there's always a counter argument. We make a solid argument, and the solid argument is, guess what? Open up the Torah, first chapter, first verse, first word. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He is the creator of the earth. He first gave it to the Canaanite people, and then he decided that this land is going to be for the Jewish people. So if God says that this land belongs for the Jewish people, he didn't only mean that it should belong to the Jewish people when they left Egypt and 40 years later they enter the land. And it doesn't mean up to King David, and it doesn't mean up to when the first temple was destroyed or the second temple was destroyed. It means that it'll always be the home land of the Jewish people. So what's our right to this land? It is based on one solid foundation. And what is that?
God gave it to us.
God gave it to us. So if you can create a sense from our education from when we're very young, that number one, we take God seriously. God is not a joke. God is a real part of our life. God is engaged in this world and engaged in my life. And this God is the one who appropriated the land of Israel to the Jewish people. I'm telling you now, if we believe it and our children believe it, there's no movement, there's no argument that can ever be made to sway us. Think of a home. You know, the greater and the stronger and deeper the foundation, the fundamentals of the home, the harder it is for a storm to knock it down. Okay, so if you create weak roots, weak foundations, no wonder Jewish kids are going to flounder. The storm will knock them over. But look at the education, counter the education of children like my own kids, myself. I thank God every day that I was blessed in such a way. You know, the kids that are getting a proper Jewish education, the day schools, they are teaching their kids the ideas that I'm telling you now. I mean, there's almost none of those. When I say none, there's always an exception to the rule. But for the sake of numbers, it's so few, you can call it, that no one ever, changes teams, so to speak. Okay, no one ever goes and joins other groups. You don't see that. But children who were raised with the concept of tikkun olam, repair the world, do good for the world, those are the terms that they use. In many cases, unfortunately, sadly, they start doing harm to the world because they don't have a clear vision and understanding of where the direction should be. Yes, Paula.
Wasn't that Dennis's argument that it was from Herschel or whatever his name was?
Yeah, that hurts.
Instead of God.
Exactly. In fact, she actually says that Israel is not because God gave it to us. It was because of Herzl. She actually argues it. Thank you, Paula. That is exactly what she writes over there.
Wasn't he the father of Israel? Or
Today,
something?
modern Israeli
Yeah.
Zionists, they accept it. But I'm going to read a nice letter about that in a moment from the Rebbe. Text number 7 just shows us that it's not only about, why the opening of the Torah is with the story of Genesis to create the power that God is the creator of the world and therefore he can give the land to whoever he wants. But multiple times in the Torah, continuously, God tells Abraham, God tells Isaac, God tells Jacob that this land is a gift to you and your descendants. I just want to read from the verses of the Torah in Genesis, text number 7, page 97. Here it goes. God told Abraham, raise your eyes and look around from where you are to the north and south and to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever.
Stars in heaven.
Like the stars in the heaven. So he's promising him that you will get this land. If you teach the kids that the reason you have an attachment and a connection to the land is because God said so, he promised it to your ancestor, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, voila. Okay, now I'm not saying you have to say this, you have to believe this stuff. Now,
Yeah,
when I say you have to be
if
raised
believe
with this.
Torah,
Huh?
if you believe Torah,
Correct?
then you see it. Okay.
Exactly. So Israel education becomes meaningful when it's built on a strong foundation of Jewish education that presents God and Torah as exciting and meaningful. A lot of people today don't see Torah and God as very serious and very meaningful. People get criticized or made fun of for practicing Judaism, for keeping kosher, for keeping the Shabbat, for believing very intimately in God, that God is truly in their lives. And it's a sad part of Judaism. It's one of the things that we have to combat and struggle with. And you don't really see it as much in the Christian side. Christians sort of actually look up to people who have that kind of, that's a whole other discussion. the Rebbe actually confirms the idea that you just mentioned, Sandra, and that's on page number 98, text number 8. Let me read the letter that the Rebbe wrote to a president of Israel in the 1960s. His name was Zalman Shazar. I don't know if you heard of him. He wasn't the first president of Israel, maybe the third president. Now, a president in Israel is not the guy who runs the country. It's an honorary position. Prime minister is the one who runs the country. So like today, the president of Israel, oh boy, I think it's a guy named Isaac Herzog. I hope I got it right. I think so. You see, that's how like, they don't do really, I mean, it's an honorary position, but they're not making political decisions, so I think it's Isaac Herzog. All right, here we go. Here's what the Rebbe writes to the president of Israel at that time. They were in communication and discussing this topic that we're discussing right now. How do we see the land of Israel? Is it has Israel been a formation in 1948 and like nothing happened before that? Or we as Jewish people see 1948 as just a new event, but it's part of the history of the land of Israel and the connection of Jews to it. Let's read what the Rebbe writes. Here it goes. I have received complaints. The Rebbe is saying this. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, Eretz HaKodesh? Today in Israel, they call it Eretz Yisrael, not Eretz HaKodesh, not the Holy. Holy Land gives it the vibe of like, it's from the Torah, it's old stuff. That's not our arguments. Our arguments are modern day history, that it's the laws, so on and so forth. So here's what the Rebbe writes. And the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel. Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. That's all happened, was liberated. Guess what? Israel was liberated many times. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or the authorization of the nations of the world has no strength or justification in terms of authentic response to the claim, you are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others. Means, remember I quoted the Midrash from 1700 years ago? You can't answer that, well, I conquered in 1948, it's mine. Well, then everybody's going to say, well, it's by violating all these human rights issues. You don't get to answer that. A claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations and Vatican. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of the Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving the IDF, for the Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well. In order for us to boost our morale and not get stuck in those who are making these accusations, it should just roll off, all the accusations don't get penetrated into my soul, into my heart. They just roll off. Is if I believe in something fundamental, something foundational, that it's a God-given land. There's nothing else you can do. And those kids that believe that were taught in such a way, their morale stands high.
I think that evangelical Christians also,
they support that. They support that as well. And some Jews have
their Bible says it too.
Yes, they're according exactly, and that's why, because it's an objective source. Their source of authority is much different than the source of authority of haters of Israel. That's why you have to be careful what your source of authority is in life. That's why Christians today, at least American Christians, have become one of the greatest allies of Israel. I want to end the lesson because we ran out of time, but I want to end the lesson, and I want to sort of delve a lot deeper into an interesting idea, and go into a philosophical understanding of why do we need a land? I mean, at the end of the day, what was the source of the survival of the Jewish people in the diaspora? We've been traveling for 2,000 years, and I don't know if we ended the travel. Country to country to country, Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazic Jews, European travels. We're migrating from here to there. we're only new in the United States. I mean, the United States is a fairly new country, but we weren't here all the time. So we're coming from some other place. What was the survival? What was the way? What was the thing that kept us alive?
The traditions.
The traditions, which is the Torah, which means that our survival is a spiritual survival. We are spiritual people, and many people see us in such a case. And they say, this is the deeper argument. So I'm not giving you source of authority arguments. I'm giving you spiritual, deeper philosophical ideas that perhaps an anti-Semite doesn't even know that that's the reason, but it's in their subconscious. They're saying, I don't understand why these people need a land. Every other nation needs a land because that's what brings them together. It is the definition of the people is the land. By us, it's the reverse. It's the nation and the connection to Torah that makes us a people. And the truth is the proof is in the pudding, because we have existed primarily. Most Jews have not lived in Israel. We're here, voila. We know the Torah. We're practicing it. We love it. We love God. We're still here today. So we're a spiritual people. And in a way, they're arguing and they're saying, you don't need a land. What do you need a land for? You're spiritual people. Go continue living in all over the world. Okay, so you get pushed around a little, but you guys figure it out. You guys are eternal. You don't belong in the land of Israel. That's a deeper argument against Jews.
Yeah.
Why you shouldn't have a land. You don't need it. Normal people need it. Not normal people like Jews don't need a land to keep them alive. It's not our definition. It doesn't make us a people. Most lands make you a people. If Italy, if Italians were to be dispersed around the world and you got rid of all the Italians, they would cease to be Italians.
Yeah.
There are no more Romans the way they were in the past. There are no more Babylonians. There are no more the Persian Empire. They're all gone because the country sees, the people seizes. By us, it doesn't. It's the reverse. You can take us out of our land. You can torture us. You can do all these terrible things to us. You can't kill us. We're like spiritual entity. So that is an argument that they're posing. So why do we really? So maybe they're right. Maybe we shouldn't have a land. Why is it important for us to have a land? Why are we making this big fight? We need to have this land. So the deeper idea is like this. We have to understand the purpose of creation of the world. Why did God create the world?
We just said it, didn't we?
Yeah, to partner with God in completion of the creation of the world. Did God create a complete world? Not at all.
Co-creators.
We're co-creators. We are his partners in the creation of the world. That's why the world was built with literally no entities. There were no buildings on it, no skyscrapers, no iPhones. God could have created the world with iPhones right away, off the bat. Could have had all the technology, all the medicine, all the science, the whole judicial system, the arts, architecture, everything could have been built right into it. But then there would be no purpose in life. The whole purpose for us is to build and create the world. And here's the point of that creation. The purpose is that whatever we create in the physical, and we're engaged in this world, all of our engagement in this world must turn and be connected with the divine. For the purpose, the sole purpose of us being the servants of Hashem. So if we take a phone, let's use it to help do good things with it. If we have a fork and a knife and food, let's use it to energize us up so we have energy to do good things.
Alignment with it.
Exactly, alignment with God. As long as we keep doing that, we are fulfilling our mission in life, which is a much different message than all other religions, if I may say so. I'm not a comparative religion scholar, but I don't know if other religions discuss it in the way we are. We Jewish people have to be engaged in the world. We're not allowed to become what we call monastic, being a monk. We don't go, God didn't say, go to the Himalayas and fast and don't speak and dress in the most, humble clothing. No, Judaism says, keep the Sabbath. What's the Shabbat all about? You've been to my house, eat a beautiful meal, 1 course, 2 course, 10 course. Jewish people have 20 course meals on any given Friday night. You think Thanksgiving is a big deal? We do Thanksgiving 100 times more than on a weekly basis. Enjoy. Passover. They try to kill us, we eat. Purim, they try to kill us, we eat. So whenever we're engaged in worldly things, that's what the Torah is all about. I shouldn't say all, but many of the mitzvot, most of them are focused on physical engagement. Other religions say less engagement. If you want to be close to God, go away from the world. Detach yourself. So people see other people who engage in worldly matters as being weak, sinful. You follow what I'm saying? So Judaism says the opposite. Judaism says we must engage in the world, but transform it for Hashem's purpose, for God's purpose. So in order for us to advocate this purpose and this mission, we must have a physical land. So what comes first? Us, the Jewish people, come first, and the land comes secondary. The land helps us with our mission. Look at Israel today.
Amazing.
I think the population of Israel is now going on 7 million Jewish people in the land of Israel. I think so. I think it's 8 million people, but 7 or 6.5 million of them are Jewish people. So the message to the world is that the purpose of life is to be engaged in the world. So having a land helps us to deliver the message in a much more powerful and more meaningful, right? That this is our land. We must have a piece of land, because if we remain a spiritual entity, then everybody will say, "Oh, the message is be spiritual, disengaged from the world." But having a land only emphasizes the delivery of our message, that to do God's purpose and be God's true partner, you must have a piece of land. So God designated that land as the Holy Land. I don't know why he chose that place where there's no oil,
Right.
there's no rain.
You used to always say it's worse.
I have my thoughts on that, but that'll be for later. Anyhow,
Well, my
so that,
father said that's why he gave it to us.
That's
So
a-
it's not because of
Right.
its inherent value.
anyhow, so that is the conclusion. I don't know if it's the conclusion, but it is the idea that I wanted to present today about anti-Semitism and how we can try to influence our youth and the younger people to have a much more balanced understanding of our connection to the land of Israel. All right. Does anybody have any questions, comments, compliments, complaints? All complaints can go to Gary.
Poor Gary.
All righty.